The long and bloody guerrilla war in Ireland between the Irish Republican Army and the British Army finally came to an end in January 1922. But the peace treaty's division of the island proved more than controversial. The new Irish state is only a few months old when it descends into civil war. The Anglo-Irish War of 1919 to 1921 saw the Irish Republican Army fight the British Army and local police in the cause of Irish independence from Britain. Backed by the Republican Sinn Féin party, the IRA used guerrilla tactics to ambush police patrols, assassinate officials, and degrade British power. The British responded by first sending Great War veterans to the Black and Tan paramilitary police, introducing martial law, and cracking down with brutal reprisals. By 1921, the IRA was near breaking point, and UK public support for the war was weaker than ever. A truce ended the fighting, followed by a controversial peace treaty signed in early 1922. The Anglo-Irish Treaty included many contentious articles. Ireland would not become an independent republic, but would remain in the British Empire as a free state. 6 largely Protestant counties in the northeast of Ireland would be partitioned and would stay in the UK, while members of the Irish Parliament would have to swear an oath of allegiance to the King. The treaty had also been signed in controversial circumstances. Eamon de Valera, the president of the self-proclaimed Irish Republic, did not attend the negotiations in London and led opposition to the treaty. Leading the support for the treaty was Michael Collins, a popular figure in the Republican movement. He claimed that the treaty was not perfect, but was a stepping stone for full independence later on. In the end, the Irish Parliament approved the peace deal in a very close vote, and de Valera resigned. So Ireland had a peace treaty and partial independence, but its political and military leadership was now bitterly split into 2 factions, the pro- and anti-treatyists. The pro-treatyists established the provisional government in Dublin and wanted to implement the treaty quickly. They claimed that they had overwhelming public support, and although anti-treaty politicians blocked a plebiscite on the issue, 24 of 26 Southern Irish city councils did pass resolutions in favour of the treaty. Sinn Féin founder Arthur Griffith now became president, and Collins chairman of the provisional government. The anti-treatyists, led by de Valera, refused to accept the new government, claiming it had no authority to disestablish the republic that had been announced in the 1916 Easter Rising. The IRA also split into pro- and anti-treaty factions. Much of the experienced leadership of the General Headquarters supported the treaty, but they had limited control of IRA units in the field. Of the 16 IRA commands in Ireland, only 5 wholly or largely supported the treaty. The southwestern region of Munster soon became the anti-treaty heartland. Tensions were increasing, and violence between rival groups was barely avoided in February 1922. The split in the IRA was further exacerbated when the provisional government created an official armed forces, the National Army. The army was based on the British model of a conventional force, and the pro-treatyists attempted to portray it as the successor of the IRA. In March, the anti-treaty forces held a series of banned IRA conventions and formed a new army executive separate from the National Army. With about 2/3 of IRA brigades represented, the executive claimed it would no longer answer to Dublin. The new group elected 1st Southern Division Commander Liam Lynch as its leader. That's not to say all IRA cooperation stopped. Anti- and pro-treaty leaders, including Lynch and Collins, continued to work together in the partitioned Northeast as late as April 1922. Both factions did make plans for a united offensive against British control, but they were never acted upon. So as rival Irish governments and armies formed, the British quickly and quietly left the territory of the future Irish Free State. The departing Brits handed over barracks and equipment to whichever IRA brigade controlled the region, and often the British left behind a power vacuum. Law and order in Ireland quickly began to suffer after the British forces left. Sectarian violence, agrarian agitation, strikes, robberies, and looting all became more common. Republican unity had largely kept the peace during the Anglo-Irish War, but this was beginning to unravel. Pro-treaty minister Kevin O'Higgins described the difficult position of the provisional government. Simply 8 young men in the city hall stand amidst the ruins of one administration, with the foundations not yet laid, and with wild men screaming through the keyhole. No police force was functioning throughout the country, no system of justice was operating, the wheels of administration hung idle, battered out of recognition by the clash of rival jurisdictions. Talk of civil war was also becoming more frequent, including from former President de Valera in March. The treaty barred the way to independence with the blood of fellow Irishmen. It was only by civil war after this that they would get their independence. If you don't fight today, you will fight tomorrow. And I say, when you are in a good fighting position, then fight on. Some members of the IRA executive, led by Rory O'Connor, decided to act while the provisional government was weak. On April 14th, around 180 men of the Dublin No. 1 Brigade occupied the 4 courts in Dublin, the nation's most important judiciary building. Clearly reminiscent of the Easter Rising in 1916, the move was designed to undermine the authority of pro-treatyists in their capital, and perhaps provoke British reaction, which could potentially reunite the IRA against their mutual enemy. At the same time, though, de Valera and Collins were attempting to reconcile. Both suggested putting forward a unified Sinn Féin in the coming election in June, but the plans soon broke down amid suspicion from both sides. The British claimed it was tantamount to refuting the treaty. When the election results came in on June 16th, pro-treaty Sinn Féin won a convincing victory with 58 seats to the anti-treatyists' 32. Britain now put pressure on the provisional government to end the 4 courts occupation, which had been going on since April. Then, on June 22nd, 2 IRA gunmen, both former soldiers in the British Army, assassinated British Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson in London. The British government stated that if the Irish provisional government could not impose order, British forces would return to Ireland and do it themselves. Winston Churchill made his position clear in the House of Commons. The presence in Dublin of a band of men styling themselves the headquarters of the Republican executive is a gross breach and defiance of the treaty. The time has come when it is not unfair, premature, or impatient of us to make to the strengthened Irish government and new Irish Parliament a request in express terms that this sort of thing must come to an end. If it does not, then we shall regard the treaty as having been formally violated. With the British gone but threatening to return, and the 4 courts still occupied by anti-treatyists, the Irish Provisional Government's new National Army issued an ultimatum on June 28, 1922. If the occupiers wouldn't leave, the army would open fire. During their 2-month occupation, the IRA had done little to fortify the 4 courts building or develop defences, partly out of a desire not to provoke the National Army. There were also no plans to assist the garrison if it was attacked, and they didn't occupy the surrounding buildings either. IRA leader Ernie O'Malley estimated he needed 70 more men to fully defend the large building. Still, the IRA were armed with rifles, automatic weapons, mines, and the Mutineer, a Rolls-Royce armoured car. In the early hours of June 28th, Major General Emmett Dalton of the National Army issued an ultimatum to the 4 courts occupiers: surrender or face bombardment from his British-supplied 18-pounder field gun. The IRA refused, and so at 4:30 a.m., after a misfire reportedly rectified by a kick, the National Army fired the first shells at the 4 courts. The Irish Civil War had begun. As the bombardment started, National Army troops cordoned off the area and probed closer, but their inexperience began to show. They were reluctant to assault the building, and British General Neville Macready suggested that the artillery was more useful as a morale booster than an actual weapon. I agreed to send Dalton 50 rounds of shrapnel, which was all we had left, simply to make a noise through the night, as he was afraid that if the guns stopped firing, his men would get disheartened and clear off. About every quarter of an hour during the night, a shrapnel broke up against the walls of the 4 courts, making much noise, but doing no harm. British civil servant Alfred Cope was equally unimpressed with the fighting. This is not a battle. Rory is in the four courts. Free Staters are in the houses opposite, each firing at the other hundreds of rounds with probably remarkably few hits. A few hundred yards away, the people carry on their ordinary business. The next day, the IRA tried to relieve the Four Courts garrison from outside Dublin, but efforts were poorly organised and blocked by the National Army. But a smaller group of IRA fighters were able to occupy several hotels along O'Connell Street, later called the Block. They were soon joined by anti-treaty leaders including De Valera, former Defence Minister Cathal Brugha and Lynch. However, these new positions could do little to support the Four Courts. On June 30th, National Army troops stormed the Four Courts with fixed bayonets. During the short fight that ensued, a huge explosion damaged the public archives, destroying hundreds of years of Irish records. There is debate about whether this was caused deliberately by IRA mines or munitions being hit by artillery. In any case, the explosion marked the surrender of the Four Courts. The National Army now turned to the Block, where the morale of IRA fighters like Emmett Humphreys was weakening. We were becoming more and more frustrated at the fact that we were achieving nothing whatsoever. Some IRA men talked about going down as martyrs, but few were enthusiastic. Instead, De Valera and others were smuggled out of the city before the Bloc surrendered on July 5th. Brugha, however, charged out into the street where National Army troops shot him down. The storming of the Four Courts was a disaster for the IRA. 12 of the executive's 16 members were there, and Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Tom Barry, and others were arrested. Liam Lynch was captured, but later released on the promise that he would not continue the fight, a promise he soon broke. The occupation had not resulted in a surge in public support or sympathy for the Republican movement. By the end of the siege, 65 combatants and civilians had been killed and 281 wounded. Perhaps the most important political consequence, however, was that the Dublin battle clarified the civil conflict. It was now the Irish Free State versus Irish Republicans. The Free State had defeated the Republicans at the Four Courts, but the Irish Civil War was far from over. Despite the Four Courts debacle, the IRA still seemed to hold a military advantage. In July, the Free State announced an expansion of the National Army to 35,000 men, but many of these were young, raw recruits attracted by regular pay. The Dublin Guard, made up of IRA veterans and former Dublin Fusiliers, would become the shock troops of the National Army. But what the National Army lacked in experience, it made up for in firepower. Britain provided the Free State Army with rifles, Lewis guns, revolvers, grenades, machine guns, artillery, trucks, armoured cars, and even aircraft. The Free State government also instructed the media to reinforce it as the legitimate government of Ireland. The army must always be referred to as the Irish Army, the National Army, National Troops, or simply Troops. The IRA irregular forces must not be referred to as the executive forces, nor described as forces or troops. They are to be called bands or bodies. The Free State estimated around 12,900 IRA fighters were still active, especially in the southwest. Many of these were veterans of the Anglo-Irish War, although their quality had been diluted by new arrivals following the truce, and they only had one rifle for every 2 men. Nonetheless, 3/4 of the country could be considered anti-treaty territory, and the largest and most experienced IRA divisions, the 1st and 2nd Southern, were strongly anti-treaty. Given IRA weakness, Lynch ordered his units back to their home turf to take over pro-treaty barracks and towns. But some IRA leaders, like Seamus Robinson, told Lynch he was being too cautious. "Liam, it's absurd to stay in your own areas, for they'll take you piecemeal." In reality, there was little central control over IRA forces. In July, the National Army began to advance to prevent a rival government from forming in Munster. The IRA abandoned County Wexford, and Lynch tried to form a defensive line running from Limerick to Waterford. But the line was an illusion. There were few defensive positions, and the IRA rarely even contested it. On July 20th, the National Army captured Limerick after a short battle, breaking communications between the IRA in Munster and the north. Waterford fell soon afterwards, followed by Westport, Carrick, Redmondstown and Clonmel by early August. IRA successes were limited to clearing a couple of towns of their pro-treaty garrisons. In most cases, the IRA withdrew in the face of overwhelming firepower and only fought pitched battles around the villages of Brewery and Kilmallock. In early August, General Dalton shifted his strategy to focus on weak IRA coastal defences. On August 8, National Army troops landed at Union House and Youghal in amphibious assaults, which were diversions for the main landing at Passage West near Cork. Exhausted IRA fighters like Frank O'Connor struggled to mount a coherent defence. Technically, a landing from the sea is supposed to be one of the most difficult military operations, but as we handled the defence, it was a walkover. On August 10th, the National Army took the IRA stronghold of Cork, followed by the last IRA military base at Fermoy. After a string of National Army victories, the so-called Munster Republic was over, and some IRA men began to talk of surrender. Instead, Lynch ordered his forces to form flying columns and conduct guerrilla operations. This was a return to their old methods and led to new successes. On August 22, 1922, Michael Collins toured the southwestern regions recently captured by the National Army, despite warnings from his colleagues. Officially, he went to inspect the troops, but oral evidence suggests that he wanted to start peace talks with the IRA. In the early hours, Collins and General Dalton left Cork in a convoy consisting of a motorcycle scout, a Crossley tender, a touring car, and an armoured car bringing up the rear. When passing through a valley, the convoy asked a local for directions. Unbeknownst to Collins, that local was also an IRA sentry, who recognized Collins and informed his unit. Assuming the convoy might use the same route to return, the IRA blocked the road with a cart and mined it to prepare the ambush. But by 8 p.m, the convoy had not returned, and most of the ambushing party left. 5 men remained to dismantle the blockade, but just as they got started, the convoy arrived. The IRA men launched an impromptu ambush. Dalton told Collins to drive straight through, but instead, Collins ordered his men out to fight. The resulting firefight lasted 30 minutes, during which the armoured car's machine gun jammed. Towards the end of the skirmish, Collins rose from cover with his rifle in his hand and was fatally shot through the neck. He was the only casualty on either side. Michael Collins' death is perhaps the single most controversial moment of the Irish Civil War, and who fired the fateful bullet is still hotly debated. The most common suspect is IRA man and former British Army marksman Sonny O'Neill, but there are other theories as well. Some Republican historians suggest that he was killed by his own entourage, even by Dalton himself, because Collins wanted to make peace with the IRA. Some have said that De Valera set up the hit, and others point to the Scottish gunner on the National Army armoured car, since he later joined the IRA. Many of these theories first arose long after the event, based on statements from people who were not there at the time. In any case, Collins, the most influential of the pro-treatyists, was now dead. So the Free State had lost one of its leaders, but the National Army still held the upper hand, and now it cracked down on the IRA harder than ever before. After Collins' death, W.T. Cosgrave replaced him as chairman of the Provisional Government. Originally, the British were doubtful about the civilian Cosgrave, but he soon proved a willing commander. Collins had largely been reluctant to instigate harsher policies against the IRA, many of whom were his former colleagues. Cosgrave, however, would have few such reservations. From August, the war began to resemble the Anglo-Irish conflict that had come before it, a reality that General Dalton recognized. The IRA have now adopted a type of warfare of which they have years of experience. They now operate over territory which they know. They are now better armed and better trained than when they were against the British. In short, they have placed me and my troops in the same position as the British were a little over a year ago. In August alone, the National Army lost 58 men in IRA ambushes, and it now became harder to strike back at IRA groups. As the war began to resemble an insurgency, National Army troops became frustrated. often the IRA would fire the first volleys in an attack, kill or wound soldiers, and then immediately surrender before the National Army could fire back. In such circumstances, commanders reported it was hard to prevent their troops executing prisoners. Pressure mounted on Cosgrave to allow the official execution of captured fighters as a deterrent to such tactics. The result in October was the Army Special Powers Resolution. It allowed the military to establish special courts to try suspected IRA fighters and execute them if necessary. Commander-in-Chief Richard Mulcahy had a blunt message for the Irish Parliament. Life must be taken if necessary, and it is the responsibility of the government to say that it must be taken. Even the Catholic Church lent their support to the Free State. Captured IRA fighters were to be denied communion, and an official pastoral statement made the Church position clear. The guerrilla warfare now being carried on by the irregulars is without moral sanction, and therefore the killing of national soldiers in the course of it is murder before God. In response, Lynch ordered the assassination of all parliamentarians who voted for the resolution, but the attacks were immediately answered by the firing squad. In November, the first executions based on the resolution were carried out. Eventually, high-ranking Republican figures like Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, and Erskine Childers were executed, supposedly in response to IRA attacks. The brutal government policy seemed to work, since Lynch abandoned his assassination attempts in December. The government resolution allowed for official reprisals, which also became increasingly common. The Dublin Guard gained a grisly reputation in Kerry for its brutality, including executing IRA prisoners with mines. However, unlike British reprisals in the Anglo-Irish War, the National Army usually directed their attacks against specific individuals and not entire communities. The IRA's guerrilla campaign in late 1922 began to flounder in the face of government executions, and the Republican cause was in trouble. By early 1923, IRA morale had plummeted and men were already disbanding and returning home. Politically as well, the anti-treaty side was in tatters. De Valera was increasingly sidelined by military leaders and failed to form a viable political alternative to the Free State. Meanwhile, as the National Army shifted to cordon and search operations, more IRA fighters and leaders were arrested or killed. On April 10th, National Army troops fatally wounded Liam Lynch himself in County Waterford. By the time of his death, 12,000 IRA fighters were in custody. Lynch's replacement, Frank Aiken, understood that the struggle was now over. On May 24, 1923, he ordered all remaining Republican units to ditch their weapons and go home. De Valera's joint statement suggested future operations might be possible, but in reality, the Irish Civil War was over. Further struggle on your part would now be in vain, and the continuance of the struggle in arms is unwise in the national interest. Military victory must be allowed to rest for the moment with those who have destroyed the Republic. By the end of the fighting, about 750 pro-treaty troops had been killed, along with a similar number of anti-treatyists, at least 78 of whom were executed by the Free State. So why did the IRA, who seemed so effective against the British, fail against the National Army barely a year later? Historians have suggested several reasons. Firstly, the IRA, a mostly irregular formation, was unsuited to position warfare or defensive battles. Liam Lynch's decision not to push on Dublin has been criticised, as it gave the provisional government time to breathe, receive British support, and take out isolated IRA brigades. Many National Army officers were former IRA men themselves, so they understood IRA tactics and even knew the locations of safe houses and weapons caches. The Four Courts occupation has also been highlighted as naive, wasteful, and poorly executed. Even at the time, IRA commanders were criticized for acting like common soldiers, with many being captured as a result. But perhaps the most critical issue for the IRA was a lack of public support. The Four Courts occupation did not get the sympathy of the Easter Rising of 1916, and throughout the Civil War, IRA commanders complained of local hostility in some regions. Anti-treaty leader Harry Boland admitted that the population was against them. There is no doubt that the people, in the main, is against us at present, believing that we are to blame for the present state of affairs. Some of the public opposition to the IRA was based on the dire economic situation. Many of the anti-treaty regions were those most economically damaged by the Anglo-Irish War, and IRA activities and the need to raise finances limited economic recovery. IRA attacks on railways in particular earned public scorn. For a sizable portion of the public, the Free State seemed to be the only institution capable of providing security, peace, and economic recovery after years of conflict. The IRA was no longer the face of popular rebellion, and although attritional guerrilla tactics worked against a perceived foreign occupier, they were much less effective against a government largely seen as legitimate. But the end of the Civil War was not the end of violence, especially in the partitioned North. Sectarian violence and assassinations would continue, even after Ireland gained full independence from Britain in 1937. In the 1960s, rival paramilitary organizations, some of whom claimed continuation from the IRA, would engage in a 30-year conflict in Northern Ireland simply called the Troubles. Only in 1998, after nearly a century of violence, the Good Friday and Belfast agreements brought peace to Ireland that has lasted for more than 20 years. The bitter and tragic Irish Civil War is just one of the conflicts that we think that it's important to cover in our documentaries. We also made an epic documentary about the Battle of Berlin in 1945 called 16 Days in Berlin. It's 4.5 hours long, over 18 episodes, taking you through the battle day by day. It features original film footage from Soviet cameramen, never-before-seen photos of the battle, detailed maps and animations, and expert interviews with David Willey from the Tank Museum, Ian from Forgotten Weapons, and more. Unfortunately, we can't upload this series to YouTube because it shows the grim reality of the Second World War, and that would get us demonetized or worse. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin in 4K resolution? On Nebula, a streaming service that we built together with other creators and where we can upload documentaries without the fear of demonetization. We'd like to thank Mark Newton for his help with this episode, and, as usual, you can find all our sources for the episode in the video description. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War, a production of Real Time History and the only YouTube history channel that believes there is no doubt that the people in the main is with us.